Today, we're ranking every rank in Hitler's Nazi army, from the terrified teenage private handed a rifle to the Field Marshal's baton that almost nobody in the entire war ever held. And trust me, some of these promotions were earned in blood, and some were just political theater. Rank 16, Schütze or Oberschütze. Picture a 19-year-old stepping off a troop train somewhere near Smolensk, carrying a rifle he's fired maybe 40 times in his life. That's a Schütze, the base rank, the bottom of the entire pyramid. No stripes, no authority, no say in anything. After 6 months of surviving whatever the army threw at him, he might get bumped to Oberschütze, which sounds like a promotion and mostly wasn't. Same duties, same risk, just a few extra pfennigs a day and a tiny cloth star. Millions of German soldiers spent the entire war at this level and never left it. Not because they weren't capable, but because the Wehrmacht simply didn't have enough slots above them to move everyone up. Rank 15, Gefreiter. Here's a fact almost everyone already knows, dressed up with the part that usually leave out. Adolf Hitler himself spent all of World War I as a Gefreiter and was never promoted higher. The popular explanation is that his superiors doubted his leadership potential. The less repeated detail is that Hitler served as a regimental messenger, a job that kept him rotating between the front and headquarters. Useful, dangerous, but not a role that naturally led toward NCO training. What's well documented and far less talked about is that this same corporal was recommended for the Iron Cross First Class by his Jewish adjutant, Hugo Goodman, an award rarely given to someone of his rank. In the actual German army rank chart, though, Gefreiter itself was just the first rung above buck private, your first sign that a superior trusted you not to get someone killed through sheer inexperience. Rank 14, Obergefreiter, Stabsgefreiter. By the time you hit Obergefreiter, you were the guy new arrivals actually listened to, not because you outranked anyone in a formal sense, but because you'd lasted long enough to know which sounds meant incoming and which didn't. No command authority came with it. Just survival credibility. Stabsgefreiter, introduced partway through the war, existed for a stranger reason. By the mid-war years, the army was chronically short on NCO slots to promote people into, so it created an entire extra pay grade whose only real function was to keep experienced soldiers from feeling stuck and demoralized. It wasn't a combat rank. It was a retention tool wearing a uniform. Rank 13, Unteroffizier. This is where the story actually changes. Unteroffizier was the first true non-commissioned officer rank, and it mattered more in the German army than the equivalent did almost anywhere else. German doctrine leaned hard on something called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, where a commander gave the objective and trusted the man on the ground to decide how to get there. That trust landed squarely on the Unteroffizier. A green lieutenant might outrank him on paper, but in a firefight, it was very often the sergeant who actually made the call that kept the section alive. Rank 12, Feldwebel, Oberfeldwebel. Ask any German veteran who actually ran a company day-to-day, and most won't say the captain. They'll say der Spieß, literally the spear, the nickname for the company's senior Feldwebel. He controlled the duty rosters, the punishments, the supplies, and every small piece of misery or mercy that made up a soldier's daily existence. Officers came and went with transfers and casualties. The Spieß often didn't. Oberfeldwebel was the natural next step up this same ladder. More seniority, more administrative weight, same unglamorous essential job of keeping a company from falling apart from the inside. Rank 11, Stabsfeldwebel. This one's the quiet outlier of the whole list, a senior NCO rank typically reached only after well over a decade of service, often held by men who'd been soldiers since before the war even started. There was no dramatic combat story attached to reaching it, just longevity, paperwork, and the accumulated trust of an entire career spent making sure everyone under a Feldwebel actually had boots, bullets, and food. Unglamorous doesn't mean unimportant. Armies don't run on medals. They run on people like this. Rank 10, Leutnant. Now the picture flips completely. Below this line, rank was mostly earned through years of surviving. Above it, you could arrive as a 20-year-old fresh from officer cadet training, a Fahnenjunker, and suddenly be giving orders to sergeants who'd been fighting since before you finished school. Junior lieutenants across most WW2 armies took disproportionate casualties, and the German army was no exception. Doctrine and tradition both expected the platoon's lieutenant to be near the front of an assault, not directing it from safety behind the line. Rank 9, Oberleutnant. Here's a number that surprises people. By 1943 and 1944, an enormous share of German infantry companies weren't commanded by the captain the org chart called for. They were commanded by an Oberleutnant, because the actual Hauptmann had already been killed, wounded, or captured, and there simply wasn't a replacement of the right rank available. Oberleutnant on paper meant senior first lieutenant, usually a company executive officer. In practice, especially late in the war, it increasingly meant the man actually running this company, whether the paperwork admits it or not. Rank 8, Hauptmann. The word itself literally translates to headman, and it predates the Wehrmacht, predates the Nazi Party, predates the Kaiser's army. It traces back through centuries of German-speaking military tradition. That continuity matters, because it's a reminder that most of this rank structure wasn't a Nazi invention at all. It was inherited, Prussian, centuries-old scaffolding that the Third Reich simply plugged its own ideology into. A Hauptmann typically commanded a full company, or an artillery battery, roughly 100 to 200 men, whose survival depended on decisions he made in seconds, not committee meetings. Rank 7, Major, Oberstleutnant. Cross this line and you're no longer managing 100 men, you're managing a battalion or a regiment, several thousand strong, and the job shifts from lead the assault to coordinate the war. It also got more politically exposed. As the war dragged into 1943 and 1944, National Socialist Leadership Officers, NSFOs, essentially party political officers, started attaching themselves at this level and above, watching for ideological reliability as closely as tactical competence. A major or Oberstleutnant now had two bosses to satisfy: the tactical situation in front of him and the regime behind him. Rank 6, Oberst, full colonel, regimental commander, and, according to plenty of Allied intelligence assessments compiled during the war, often the sweet spot of the whole German officer corps. A colonel commanded enough force to actually shape a battle, but he was still close enough to the front line to know exactly what his men could and couldn't do. Enemy intelligence officers repeatedly flagged German regimental colonels as some of the most consistently capable commanders they faced, experienced enough to be trusted with real independence, and still grounded in what was actually happening on the ground. Rank 5, General Major. What actually separated a colonel from a general in the German army? One silver star and an enormous shift in political scrutiny. After the failed July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, the Stauffenberg plot, the officer corps at general rank and above was put under a level of suspicion it had never faced before. Promotions to general major increasingly weighed political trustworthiness alongside battlefield record, and more than a few capable commanders found their careers stalled, not for losing battles, but for having the wrong friends. Rank 4, Generalleutnant. At this level, usually commanding a full corps, a strange split opens up that most ranking videos skip entirely. Post-war memoirs from senior German officers, men like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, describe a growing private disillusionment with the war's direction from around 1943 onward, even while these same men kept executing orders they privately doubted. It wasn't open rebellion. It was quiet professional obligation colliding with a political leadership that increasingly didn't tolerate dissent, even from its own generals. Rank 3, General, der Infanterie, der Panzertruppe, der Artillerie, and so on. Unlike a flat, single general rank, the German army attached a branch to it: General der Infanterie, General der Panzertruppe, General der Artillerie. It looks like bureaucratic decoration, but it's actually a holdover from an older Prussian tradition of branch identity and pride, where an infantry general and a panzer general were proud to be labeled as fundamentally different kinds of soldier, not interchangeable three-star officers. This tier typically commanded an entire army, tens of thousands of men, spread across an active front. Rank 2. Generaloberst. Colonel General, the second highest rank in the entire army, usually reserved for the men commanding an army group or an entire theater of operations. At this level, a single decision didn't just cost a company or a regiment. It could shape the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers spread across an entire front. Very few men ever wore this rank, and by the war's final years, most of them were operating under constant political pressure from a high command, increasingly disconnected from the reality on the ground. Rank 1. Generalfeldmarschall. The top of the ladder, and one of the most sparingly awarded ranks in the entire war. Estimates vary depending on how the count is drawn across branches, but only a small handful of men ever held the Army Field Marshal's baton across the whole of Nazi Germany's existence. And if you want the single most infamous story attached to this rank, it's Friedrich Paulus at Stalingrad. Hitler promoted him to Generalfeldmarschall in January 1943, in part because no German field marshal had ever surrendered in the field, the implication being unmistakable. Paulus surrendered anyway, the very next day, becoming the first and only man to hold this rank and do exactly what the promotion was designed to prevent.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.